Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, we journey to a land painted in rust and dry blood, a place ruled by a merciless Sun King, where the shadows under thorn trees hold entire worlds. This is Tsavo, a name that means slaughter in the language of its first people. It's a land of immense, breathing silence, punctuated only by the cough of a leopard, the snap of a dry branch, or the deep rumble that isn't thunder, but a lion speaking to the night. In this fierce ecology, death isn't a tragedy. It's a participant, a necessary turn in the great cycle. The grass grows from soil fed by the fallen. The hunter, in time, becomes the hunted. And in the spaces between these grand transitions, a residue remains. Bones, sun-bleached, scoured clean by tooth and time, they are scattered like white punctuation marks across the red earth. For generations, a unique people lived with this residue. They were not hunters, herders, or warriors. They were the cleaners, the Wakusanya Maifupatha bone gatherers. Theirs was a profession born of necessity and sanctified by ritual. They moved through the spaces where the great cats had feasted, and they tidied up. But this was no mere sanitation. It was a sacred dialogue with death itself, a way of maintaining a fragile peace between the world of the living village and the wild, hungry kingdom of tooth and claw. They worked in silence, under the unwavering gaze of the very creatures whose meals they cleared. And in that gaze, they sensed something more than just animal curiosity. They sensed an understanding, a recognition of their role in the order of things. They lived in the space between the living and the dead, under the eyes of the killers, performing a work of quiet reverence that kept the spiritual ecology of Tsavo in balance. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine the fire crackling as the night breathes around us. In its light, picture a clean-picked bone, white as the moon. It's not an end. It is a story waiting to be closed, a spirit waiting to be released, a debt waiting to be acknowledged. Tonight, we will walk with these quiet people. We will learn the careful rules of their collection, where touching a bone with a bare hand was a profound taboo. We will witness their evening rituals of smoke and song, meant to guide lost souls and appease powerful ones. We will hear the chilling legend of the lion that seemed to participate in their ritual, returning a skull as if in partnership. And finally, we will stand with the last cleaner as he makes a terrible calculation, looks into the eyes of his silent partners, and decides that some pacts are too deep, some understandings too terrible to bear. This is a story about the edge of the human experience. It's about a job that required one to touch death daily without being claimed by it, and to meet the gaze of the ultimate predator without showing fear. This is the story of the bone cleaners of Tsavo, and the lions that watched them work. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from under the Baobab skies. Hello and welcome. Today, we delve into a world where the boundary between life and death is not a line, but a landscape. A world where a unique profession exists, not to take life, but to tidy up after it has been taken. We are exploring the life and rituals of the bone cleaner. By the end of this journey, you'll see that their tools were never just practical instruments. They were sacred barriers, extensions of the body meticulously designed to maintain a spiritual and physical separation from the potent, dangerous essence of death. The work always began before dawn, in the cool, grey light that precedes the sun's relentless assault on the savannah. For the bone cleaner, his most important possession wasn't a weapon, but his Fimbo Ya Maifupatha bone pole. This was a tool that could never be found in nature, only made through a long, deliberate process. When a young man chose to enter this profession, his first major task was to spend an entire season searching for the perfect branch. It had to come from the Mvuli tree, known for its straight-grained, strong wood. but crucially, it needed a natural, gentle curve at one end. This curve was never carved. It was grown, a product of the tree's own life. This gentle hook was the key, allowing the cleaner to cradle a delicate skull or a heavy femur without ever needing to grasp it directly. It was a tool of respect, of distance, of safety. The crafting of the bone pole was a ritual in itself, a meditation on the task ahead. The bark wasn't stripped away with a knife, which would be too aggressive. Too much like the violence the bones had already endured. Instead, the branch was soaked and then rubbed patiently with smooth stones, a slow, gentle process that revealed the pale, clean wood beneath. The tip of the hook was then carefully hardened in a slow, smoking fire. The purpose wasn't to sharpen it, but to seal it, to make the wood less permeable to the spiritual residue believed to cling to the bones. It was a form of purification. Finally, the gripping end of the pole was wrapped with strips of dampened antelope hide. As these strips dried in the sun, they would shrink and fuse to the wood, and over time, to the unique grip of the cleaner's hand. This wasn't just a handle, it became a personalized interface, a seamless connection between the man and his sacred tool. It was an extension of his will, allowing him to work with precision while maintaining the crucial barrier. The other tools were fashioned with the exact same intent. The baskets used to carry the bones were not ordinary containers. They were woven from the tough, sharp-edged leaves of the Sansevieria plant, also known as snake plant. Its fibers were believed to possess a quality that could metaphorically cut through spiritual attachments, severing the lingering connection between the bone and the spirit that once inhabited it. To further protect the cleaner, these baskets were lined with broad, waxy leaves from the Emersufi tree. This lining acted as a waterproof and spirit-proof layer, ensuring that nothing could seep through from the bones to the basket or from the basket to the man carrying it. The cleaner's own attire was part of this protective system. He wore an apron made of thick, untreated buffalo hide. This wasn't armor against the claws or teeth of a predator. Its purpose was entirely spiritual. It was a shield, a thick layer between the core of his living body, his vital organs, his life force and the inevitable death dust that would coat his legs as he worked. Every piece of equipment was a layer of insulation, a carefully considered defense against an invisible danger. At the heart of this entire practice was one absolute, unwavering rule, whispered from the very first day of apprenticeship: Makono usigusemav. This translates to, "Let not your hand touch the bone." The reason for this strict prohibition had little to do with hygiene as we understand it today. It wasn't about germs or bacteria. The fear was of a contagion of a completely different sort. In their worldview, a bone, especially in the hours and days after the flesh has departed, was seen as a vessel. It was believed to hold the memory of the life that was lived, the raw shock of the death that came, and even the scent of the predator that made the kill. To touch such an object with bare skin was to risk a terrible kind of transfer. It was to risk having that life's memory flow into you, to have the shock of its violent end jolt your own spirit, and to carry the predator's scent as your own, potentially attracting the same fate. Therefore, the poles, the baskets, and the apron were not just tools, they were insulators. They were masterfully designed to allow the cleaner to handle the physical objects, the bones themselves, while deflecting the potent spiritual charge they were believed to carry. This system of tools and rules allowed for the necessary work to be done without the worker becoming a casualty of it, spiritually speaking. Thus equipped, the cleaner was not merely a man walking into the wild, he transformed into something more. He became a node in a sacred circuit, a specialized conductor for a very specific and dangerous task. He was an avatar of order, stepping into a realm defined by consumptive chaos. His protection came not from physical strength or weaponry, but from strict adherence to protocol. The tools were his liturgy, and their careful, deliberate use was his prayer for safety, a moving meditation that kept him whole. And so, as the very first ray of sun would cut across the vast plain, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the bone cleaner would be ready. He would sling his specially prepared baskets over his shoulder, take his sacred pole in hand, and step beyond the protective thorn boma of his camp. At that moment, he would leave the world of the fully living behind him. He would walk out into the landscape of aftermath, into the silent, bone-strewn fields, ready to perform his essential, solitary duty. This wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a spiritual practice that demanded immense discipline and a deep understanding of the forces at play in the natural world. The bone cleaner brought balance, tidying the final remnants of life's dramatic cycle, ensuring that the land could renew itself and that the spirits of the dead could rest unburdened. His work, though silent and often unseen, was a vital thread in the fabric of his world. Beyond the camp's thorn fence, the world changes. For a special kind of person, a cleaner, this isn't just wilderness, it's a library. The vast, open savanna is his archive, and every single kill site is a page, a story written in a violent, fleeting script. His first job isn't to collect, but to read, to understand the story written in the scatter of bones, the trampled grass, and the patterns of dried blood, now as dark as old coffee grounds. He moves with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the earth with a focus that's almost meditative. He's not just looking for bones, he's looking for a narrative. What happened here? A cluster of bones in a tight circle, with the long bones splintered into shards. That speaks of hyenas. They are the crushers, the efficient ones who waste absolutely nothing. Their work is messy, a chaotic jumble of fragments, but a more linear scatter, with the spine mostly articulated and the ribs splayed out in a wide arc. That suggests a lion's meal. This was a kill eaten at leisure, the carcass perhaps dragged into the shade of an acacia tree. The presence of a skull, maybe a buffalo's, with its horns still attached, but found far from the main site, that tells of a final, furious charge, a last stand before the inevitable pull to the ground. Every detail, every placement, is a word in a sentence. This reading is crucial. It's a form of forensic ecology. It tells him what happened, which in turn informs what rituals might be needed later. But more importantly, it tells him what to look for next. It dictates the nature of his work. The hyena's site will be a painstaking mess of splinters, requiring careful sifting to find the larger, identifiable pieces. The lion's site, by contrast, will be tidier. The bones are often cleaner, sometimes licked completely smooth by rough tongues. But then, there's another kind of story, a rarer, heavier chapter to read. The search for human remains. The signs for this are different, and finding them changes everything. It's not just about the bones themselves. Often, the first clues are fragments of things that don't belong here. A piece of a beaded bracelet ground into the dirt, a sharp shard from a clay pot, or the most definitive sign of all the straight, clean cut of a machete mark on a bone. Lions, after all, do not wield blades. The human bones themselves are different from the animal remains they're mixed with. They are lighter, more fragile. Finding a human skull is a moment of profound solemnity. It carries a solemn weight in the basket that has nothing to do with its physical lightness. It's the weight of a life, a community, a story interrupted. Once the reading is complete, the separation begins. This is an act of sacred geometry. Using only the simple hook on the end of his long pole, he carefully creates two distinct spaces on the ground. To his right, he places the animal bones, the heavy femur of a zebra, the gracefully curved rib of a wilder beast, the delicate, intricate ankle bones of a gazelle. These are the bones of the given world, the expected participants in the great cycle of life and death on the savannah. Their story, while violent, is simple. Their spirits, it's believed, return to the great herd of life without trouble. To his left, he places the human bones. Each one, gently moved with the hook, requires a mental note, a prayer to be said later. This is the story of interruption, of a path cut violently short. These spirits are considered more likely to be confused, to linger. They might become what are known as the Mizimu Porith, wild, lonely ghosts of the bush who can bring misfortune to the living. Separating their remains is the first act of care, the first step on their guided journey back home, away from the wilderness that claimed them. Let's just pause for a moment to consider that. Imagine the skill, the quiet focus this requires. The ability to look at a scene of what most would just call carnage, and instead see a biography. To reconstruct a final, terrible moment from its silent, sun-bleached clues, and then to begin the process of gentle, respectful disentanglement. It's a unique form of empathy, a deep understanding of the language of the wild. This reading of the sight serves another, more immediate, practical purpose. It tells him where to look for the watchers. A fresh kill site, especially one with human remains, is rarely ever truly abandoned. The authors of the violence, the lions, or the hyenas are often still nearby, resting in the shade, digesting their meal. And they are watching. The cleaner's movements are a language in themselves. His slow, non-threatening pace, his complete lack of interest in any remaining meat, his focused, ritualized behavior, all of these are signals to the predators. He is not a competitor. He's not a scavenger looking for a meal. He is something else, a part of the process they don't understand but seem to respect. He's the editor, tidying the page they have written. He often feels their gaze before he ever sees them. It's a pressure between his shoulder blades, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He never, ever turns quickly. A slow, sidelong glance might reveal a tawny shape hidden in the tall grass, or a pair of ears twitching just above a termite mound. And the work continues under that mutual, understanding watch. In the profound silence of the savannah, a silent agreement is shared between the killer and the cleaner. Think about that relationship. The lioness who made the kill, resting under a distant acacia tree, her head up, watching this strange, quiet figure who has come to tend to the aftermath. She doesn't see a threat. He doesn't show fear. There's an ancient understanding at play. He is there to restore a certain kind of balance, to ensure that the dead, both animal and human, are properly accounted for. He is a custodian of memory, a shepherd of lost souls. His tools are simple: a long pole with a hook, a sturdy basket, and a knowledge passed down through generations. A knowledge of how to read the earth, how to speak the silent language of the bush, and how to navigate the delicate boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. As he finishes his work at one site, packing the separated bones into their respective containers, his eyes are already scanning the horizon. The sun is high, the heat is intense, but the work isn't done. The library is vast, and there are always more stories waiting to be read, more pages waiting to be cleared. He is the keeper of the savannah's most brutal and sacred stories. The sorting was finally done. The baskets were loaded and ready. The animal bones, being far more numerous and often heavier, filled one large, sturdy basket. The human remains, fewer and handled with a deeper reverence, were arranged carefully in a smaller, separate one. Before leaving, the cleaner would perform a final, silent act at the site. Using the butt of his long pole, he would scrape and turn the earth, covering the last lingering stains of life and death, disturbing the ground just enough to encourage new grass to grow over the spot. It was a symbolic closing of a brutal chapter, a quiet gesture to return the land to its unmarked state. Then came the long walk back. By now, the sun was high in the sky, a relentless hammer on the anvil of the vast open land. The air itself shimmered with heat, distorting the horizon. The weight on the cleaner's shoulders was not just the physical burden of the bones. It was the immense, unseen weight of stories ended too soon, of families shattered by loss, of the immutable, unforgiving law of fang and hunger that governed this wild place. With each step, the baskets creaked, their white cargo shifting slightly adry, rattling sound against the profound silence of the plains. Every step was measured, deliberate, careful to avoid a stumble or a fall. A fall would be more than an inconvenience. It would be a profound desecration, a mixing of the carefully separated remains, a spiritual chaos that would disrupt the entire ritual. This was always the most vulnerable time. Laden with his heavy cargo, moving slowly along a known and predictable path, he was an easy target. The feeling of being watched, a constant companion out on the plains, intensified during this return journey. It was no longer the idle, curious gaze of a satiated predator resting in the shade. It felt like the assessing stare of the land itself, as if the very earth and sky were judging his purpose. The tall, dry grass seemed to hold its breath as he passed. The only sound was the incessant, high-pitched scream of the cicadas, a metallic hymn to the suffocating midday heat. The cleaner's mind, disciplined by years of ritual and routine, would often retreat inward. He trained himself not to think of the bones as people or animals he might have known. Instead, they were Misigo burdens. They were packages of ended energy that needed to be delivered to their correct destination. The cleansing fire for the human remains, and the deep ossuary pit for the bones of the animals. This mental detachment was a necessary shield against the overwhelming sorrow of his task. The path back was also a time for the initial, quiet whispers of the chants that would be sung in their full glory at dusk. Under his breath, so faint it was almost just a thought, he would begin the melodies of release. A low, resonant hum for the spirit of the zebra, a slightly higher, more delicate pitch for the gazelle. For the human bones, he would not yet chant aloud. Instead, he would simply hold their names in his mind if he knew them, or assign them a generic, respectful title if he did not. The traveler, the mother, the lost child. This silent, mental cataloguing was the first crucial step in the longer ritual of remembrance. A way of acknowledging each individual loss before the community would do so together. The camp, when it finally appeared as a smudge of brown huts and the deeper green of a cultivated plot near a seasonal stream, was not a place of joyous return. It was a place of solemn reception. Other cleaners might be returning from their own grim harvests along other paths. They would see each other in the distance and offer a slow, deep dip of the chin or nod that acknowledged the shared burden without needing a single word. Words were for the living, for the warmth of the evening fire. This bone-laden silence was its own language, understood by all who performed this sacred duty. Upon entering the cleaning camper, separate, consecrated space located downwind of the main village to keep the worlds of the living, and the dead distinct the baskets were set down in their designated areas. One area was for the final sorting and preparation of the animal bones, another for the immediate ritual attention required for the human remains. The tools of his trade, the long pole, the hooks, the scrapers were carefully cleaned and leaned against the wall of the ritual hut. Only then, after the burdens were laid down and the tools put away, could the cleaner finally stand up straight. He would roll the stiffness from his shoulders, the muscles screaming in protest, and take a long, deep drink from the gourd of cool water that was always left for him. The physical work for the day was done, but the spiritual work, the far more demanding work of release and appeasement, was about to begin. The long walk back was the bridge between the raw, brutal fact of death in the wild and the human attempt to create meaning and order from it. It was a journey weighted with the silent, rattling testimony of the ended, a solemn pilgrimage made under the watchful, unforgiving eye of the sun and the hidden masters of the tall grass. Dusk in Tsavo is a swift, beautiful surrender. The fierce blue sky of the African day doesn't fade gently. It softens to a delicate lavender, then gets streaked with vibrant orange and deep purple as the sun plunges below the horizon. For the bone cleaners, this was the sacred hour, the time when the veil between the world of action and the world of spirit felt at its thinnest. In the cleaning camp, a quiet reverence would fall as the day's work concluded. The lead cleaner, often the oldest or most experienced member of the group, would begin the preparations for the Sicilico Wa Rohotha spirit smoke. This wasn't just about burning some fragrant leaves. It was a precise, ancient art. The recipe was a sacred blend, each ingredient holding a specific purpose. First, the leaves of the morabaine, known widely as neem, were added for their powerful purifying properties. Then came the bark of the makai tree, believed to provide a sense of grounding and stability. Finally, the most special ingredient, the delicate, silver-leaved macanganato. The smoke from this plant was said to curl in slow, spiraling columns, forming a visible ladder for the spirits to ascend. These ingredients were placed in a stone mortar and pestle. The rhythmic grinding, a steady, percussive sound in the quiet of the evening, was more than just a preparation. It was a prelude to the ceremony itself. The sound was a call, a signal that the sacred work was about to begin. It was an act of intention, turning simple plants into a medium for the spiritual realm. As the last light of the sun kissed the landscape, a small, shallow pit was carefully dug in the center of the cleansing ground. This was the focal point of the entire ritual. The human bones, sorted and cleaned with meticulous care throughout the day, were now arranged in a perfect circle around this pit. A short distance away, the animal bones, already placed in their own ossuary, were acknowledged with a respectful glance. But tonight, the focus was entirely on the human remains. Their spirits were considered the wanderers. They were the ones most likely to be lost, confused and trapped by the sudden violence of their departure from the world of the living. The ground herbs, now a fine, fragrant powder, were gently placed into the pit. The lead cleaner then took out This wasn't just a tool for convenience. It was a symbolic link to the primal element of fire, an ancient technology connecting them to their ancestors. With practiced skill, a small flame was coaxed to life. It wasn't a roaring bonfire, but a smoldering, fragrant mound that began to release its precious cargo. The smoke started to rise, thick and white, against the deepening twilight. It was strange. It didn't seem to scatter on the evening breeze. Instead, it hung in the air, coalescing into a single, cohesive pillar that reached straight up towards the darkening sky. As the column of smoke grew, the lead cleaner began to speak. It wasn't a chant yet, not a formal prayer, but a gentle, guiding address, an invocation to the spirits whose physical homes lay in a silent circle around them. In a calm, compassionate voice, the words flowed into the night. You who have walked this red earth, you whose path was crossed by the great shadow, see the smoke. It is a path for you. Your bodies are here, clean and respected. But you are not the bone. You are the memory held within the bone. Follow the smoke. It will take you to the place where all memories gather. where the pain of the tooth is forgotten, where the fear of the fall is finally soothed. The words hung in the air, carried by the fragrant smoke, an invitation of peace and passage. It was a moment of profound connection, a bridge being built between the living and the dead, between a tragic end and a new beginning. One by one, the other cleaners would then rise and approach the smouldering pit. Each would take a small pinch of the smoking herbs between their fingers. They would then begin to walk the circle, tracing the ring of bones. Using a fan made of stiff, bundled grass, they would gently waft the smoke over each set of remains. This act wasn't about cleansing the bone itself. That work was already done. This was about signaling to the spirit still attached to it. It was a personal acknowledgement, a way of saying, your story is seen. Your physical journey is over. Your spiritual journey can now begin. The belief was deeply ingrained. The smoke provided a tangible medium, a visible thread for a confused spirit to grasp. It was something to hold on to, a guide to lead it out of the sticky, traumatic memory of its death. So many of these souls had met their end in fear and confusion, lost in the vast wilderness. The smoke was a lifeline, pulling them away from that final, painful moment and guiding them towards the broader, timeless collective of the ancestors. It was a gentle release from the earthly plane. Let's just pause for a moment and picture this scene. In the gathering darkness of the African bush, a single column of sweet-smelling smoke rises against a deep purple sky. It's a beautiful, incredibly poignant sight. A man-made road for lost souls, constructed from nothing more than leaf, bark, and focused human intention. It represents a profound respect for life and a deep understanding of death, not as an end, but as a transition. It's a testament to the belief that our responsibility to each other does unend when the heart stops beating. The ceremony continued in this quiet, deliberate way until all the herbs had turned to ash and the last wisp of smoke had dissipated into the vast, star-filled night. The pillar was gone. The ladder had been drawn up. The bones, now resting in their circle, were considered spiritually neutral. They were empty vessels, their former inhabitants guided safely on their way. Now, and only now, were the remains ready for their final disposal. Depending on the traditions of the people they were believed to have come from, this could mean burial in a special, consecrated grove or placement in a sacred cave of ancestors. The smoke ritual was the critical act of translation. It took a violent, random event in the wilder, tragedy without meaning and transformed it into a structured, meaningful passage within their understanding of the cosmos. This was the cleaner's greatest gift. It wasn't just about creating order for the living by cleaning and sorting the bones. It was about providing a map for the dead, a way home. As the cleaners sat in quiet contemplation, the circle of bones now empty, their work of release was complete. Under the canopy of the African night sky, they had restored balance, not just to the physical landscape, but to the spiritual one as well. In the heart of the vast, listening dark, after the last wisps of silico smoke have vanished into the night, a profound ritual begins. The smoke has cleared the path, and now a new sound rises to give it texture, a rhythm for the spirits to walk upon. The lead cleaner settles into a low, cross-legged position, facing the now empty circle where the bones had lain. The others gather around him, not in a tight, closed ring, but a loose half-circle, their formation open to the endless expanse of the night. What follows is not a song of mourning as we might understand it, not a village lament filled with sorrow. This is something else entirely. It is lower, more repetitive, a sound that feels less like a human voice and more like the deep, patient hum of the earth itself. Its purpose isn't to express grief, but to categorize the passing, to name the nature of each death. In doing so, it aims to soothe the specific disquiet that lingers around each departed soul. It's a way of bringing order to the chaos of the end. The lead cleaner begins. A single, held note drones from his chest, a vibration that seems to emanate from the very ground beneath them. This is the foundation, the unwavering sound of the earth that receives all things in the end. Upon this foundation, he starts to build the variations, each one tailored to the life and death of the individual whose bones they have just honored. Imagine the bones belonged to an elder, someone who lived a long life, not taken by a predator but by the slow, gentle wear of time. For them, the chant becomes a slow, rocking melody. It speaks of roots that have grown deep into the soil, of a full circle, now complete. It's a lullaby for a life well lived, a return that isn't a theft, but a fulfillment. The words, half-sung, half-intoned, drift on the air. Umikoka, Umpumzika, Engia, Yako, Iloquisha, Kwa, Amani. This translates to, you are tired, you have rested, your road is finished. Go in peace. It's a melody of acceptance, a gentle release into the final rest. The other cleaners sit with heads bowed, their silent participation a shared reverence for a life that has reached its natural conclusion. But now, consider the remains of a hunter or a warrior, one who lived and died in the heat of conflict, in a contest of strength. The chant transforms. The slow, rocking melody gives way to a more rhythmic, percussive quality. The cleaners begin to clap their hands softly against their thighs, creating a beat that acknowledges the struggle, the courage, and the final, overwhelming force that claimed them. This is not a lament, it is a chant of respect, almost a salute. The words carry a different weight. Shuya wamu ituni enguvu, zilikupita sasaunaenda, nawenjin wakali. This means, warrior of the bush, a greater strength passed you. Now you go to join the other fierce ones. It honors the fight, recognizing the life of action and the strength it required, even in its final moments. It sends the spirit not to a place of rest, but to an afterlife populated by other fierce, respected souls. Yet, the most intricate, the most delicate chant of all is reserved for those taken by the lions. This death is different. It is a violation of the human world's order, a raw and brutal intrusion. And so, the chant reflects this. It has no rhythm, no steady beat. Instead, it becomes a series of wavering, almost apologetic notes, like the sound of wind trying to find its way through a narrow crack in a rock. The melody is uncertain, full of sorrowful questions. The words themselves contain no promises of peace or honor, because, in the human sense, this kind of death is neither peaceful nor honorable. Instead, the chant is an explanation. It is an attempt to place this terrifying event within a larger, amoral, cosmic order, the law of the wild. The song is sung to the departed spirit, but it feels as though it is also sung to the lions, who might be listening from the darkness just beyond the firelight. The words are a plea for understanding. Malango ulifunguliwa na wenye maino. Si ofu nisharia yanika. Roho yako aisi. The door was opened by those with teeth. It is not evil, it is the law of the plains. Let your spirit hold no bitterness. This chant is a profound act of empathy. It seeks to explain the unexplainable to the victim, to tell the spirit that its end was not a result of malice, but a consequence of a law far older and more indifferent than human rules. It's a desperate attempt to untangle the spirit from feelings of anger and injustice, so it can move on without being weighed down by bitterness. It's an acknowledgement of nature's brutal, impartial reality. Let's pause here for a moment and really think about what's happening. These chants, rising and falling in the vast African night, are so much more than just music or ritual. They are a living, breathing, taxonomic system for death itself. It is a spiritual ledger, a way for this community to process the chaos of life and predation and file it into a comprehensible order. Each death is given its own category, its own unique sonic signature, its own philosophical framework. It's a way of making sense of the senseless. These ceremonies can last for an hour, sometimes longer, as the cleaners cycle through the different melodies for each set of remains collected that day. As they sing, their belief is absolute. They are not just making sounds, they are vibrating the very air around the departed spirits. They believe these sonic frequencies are literally shaking loose the last clinging fragments of terror, of confusion, of pain. They are aligning the spirit with the correct cosmic frequency for its onward journey. A spirit taken by time needs a different frequency than one taken in battle. A spirit taken by a lion needs the most careful, delicate recalibration of all. As the final note of the last chant fades into the silence of the bush, the change is palpable. The camp itself feels lighter. The immense weight of the stories, once held within the silent bones, has been transferred. It has been given to the living air, carried away on the wings of melody and intent. The dead have been spoken to, they have been categorized, they have been understood according to the specific manner of their passing. The ritual, through smoke and song, has restored a kind of narrative order to the brutal, chaotic fact of their end. The cycle is complete, and for the living, a fragile balance has been restored. Until the next day brings new bones and new stories to be sung into the night. The final act of the evening ritual was one of pure, silent reciprocity. It acknowledged the other party in this grim transaction, the predators themselves. The cleaners did not see the lions, leopards, and hyenas as mere animals or monsters. To them, these were the Wenya Nenchitha, owners of the land. They were the ultimate authority, the executors of Tsavo's most fundamental law. To live in Tsavo was to accept their sovereignty. The cleaning work was a service, but more than that, it was a negotiation with the land's rightful rulers. After the rhythmic chants faded and a deep, expectant silence settled over the camp, the lead cleaner would take a small, carved wooden bowl. This bowl was a vessel of respect. Into it, he would place a portion of their own evening's meal. These weren't scraps or leftovers. This was good food. A strip of sun-dried antelope meat from their personal stores, a handful of carefully roasted tubers, a dollop of thick, nutritious porridge that sustained their own bodies. This offering was not the leavings of the weak. It was a deliberate sharing from the very substance of the living. It was a conscious act of giving back. He would then carry this bowl to the very edge of the firelight, the precipice where the solid, safe world of the camp dissolved into the murmuring, ink-black bush. This boundary was more than just physical. It was the line between the human world and the wild, the known and the unknown. He would place the bowl carefully on a flat stone or a bare patch of earth that had been cleared for this purpose. He did not speak. There were no prayers or pleas. He did not bow or show any overt sign of submission. He simply set it down, took 3 precise steps back, and then turned and walked back to the warmth of the fire, crucially, never looking back. To look back would be to question the pact, to show a lack of trust. This was the offering. It wasn't a bribe, because one does not bribe a king in his own kingdom. It wasn't a plea for mercy. For mercy has no place in the stark logic of the hunt. It was an acknowledgement. It was a statement made in the universal language of sustenance, a language understood by all living things. The message was clear. We have taken care of what you left behind. We have sorted the bones and released the spirits. We understand our role in this ecosystem. This is our share of the work, and this food is our share of the life that flows through this land, given back to you. The owners. The belief that underpinned this ritual was profound and unshakable. If the offering was taken and by morning, it almost always was. The bowl often licked so clean it shone it signaled a continued truce. The owners of the land had accepted the arrangement. The cleaners could continue their sacred work without becoming the subject of it themselves. A mutual, unspoken respect existed between them. It was believed that the lions and other predators allowed the cleaners to walk their grounds unmolested precisely because the cleaners performed a necessary function in their world. They removed the lingering spiritual clutter of the kiln, an energy that some believed could deter future prey or attract darker, more malevolent forces to the area. The cleaners brought balance not just to the physical landscape, but to the spiritual one as well. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the world was at its quietest, the cleaners would hear it, a soft crunching sound, the delicate scrape of the wooden bowl on the stone, and then a low, contented rumble that was not a growl, but something more profound, something closer to satisfaction. They never looked. They lay in their simple huts, listening intently, their senses alive to the sounds from the darkness. To look would be to assert human curiosity over a sacred transaction, to break the formal, respectful distance that made their coexistence possible. They lay on their mats, listening, and what they felt was not fear, but a grim satisfaction. The pact was holding. The dangerous, necessary balance was being maintained for another night. By dawn, the evidence would be there. The same stone, now catching the first rays of the sun. The wooden bowl, sitting empty, polished clean, and sometimes, pressed into the soft dust beside it, a single, large, feline paw printer, silent signature on a contract renewed. This was the proof. This was the receipt. It was the confirmation that their offering had been received and accepted. This simple, elegant communication system required no words, only the consistent, respectful actions of both sides. It was a stark, honest economy of survival, one that formed the very foundation upon which their whole impossible profession stood. Their work of cleansing the dead was paid for with a share of the living, left in a bowl in the dark. It was a testament to the intricate and often brutal dance of life and death in the heart of such a dance where respect, ritual, and a deep understanding of the natural order were the only things that kept you alive. This delicate balance highlights a perspective we often lose in our modern worldview of nature, not as something to be conquered or controlled, but as a sovereign power with its own rules and its own kings. The cleaners of Tsavo didn't just work in the wilderness, they were part of it. Their survival depended on their ability to understand and honor the intricate web of relationships that governed the land. They knew that respect was a far more powerful tool than force. They understood that true strength lay not in dominance, but in balance. The ritual of the offering was more than just a superstition. It was a physical manifestation of their worldview. It was a daily renewal of a covenant between man and beast, a pact built on mutual necessity. The predators provided the work for the cleaners, and the cleaners, in turn, provided a spiritual service that, according to their beliefs, benefited the predators. The food was the currency of this transaction, a token of shared life in a land where life was a precious and fleeting commodity. This story forces us to look at the great predators not as mindless killing machines, but as intelligent beings, as the owners of the land who were capable of understanding and participating in a complex social contract. It's a humbling thought, suggesting a level of consciousness and communication in the animal world that we are only just beginning to appreciate. It reminds us that for millennia, humans have navigated their relationship with the natural world not with fences and guns, but with wisdom, respect, and a profound sense of their place within the greater whole. The pact held for generations, a fragile equilibrium of bone and offering, smoke and silence. For as long as anyone could remember, the cleaners had kept their side of the bargain, and the wild things had kept theirs. Then came the morning that changed everything. Muigné, the lead cleaner, was a man of few words and deep grooves in his face, each one carved by years of squinting into the sun-blasted distance. He was the grandson of a cleaner, the son of a cleaner. The rhythms of the work were in his blood, the rules etched deeper than the scars on his hands. His morning walk to the offering stone was as habitual as breathing, a ritual that began each day with the rising sun. It was a simple task, a check to see if the previous night's offering had been accepted. Usually, it was a bowl of milk or a piece of fat, a small gesture of respect. This morning, however, the offering stone held something else entirely. The air was still and cool, the sky a pale, milky blue. A profound quiet lay over the savannah, broken only by the distant call of a dove. Muigné's sandals crunched softly on the dry earth as he approached the flat stone at the edge of the camp. The wooden bowl from the previous night was gone, as expected, but something else was there. Something that stopped him mid-stride, his breath catching in his throat. Centered perfectly on the stone, as if placed by a careful hand, was a human skull. It was not just any skull, it was clean. Impossibly clean. This wasn't the work of sun and insects, which left behind a fragile, dusty shell. This was polished smooth, the bone a dull ivory, almost luminous in the soft morning light. The teeth were all intact, undisturbed, set in a silent, permanent grin. There were no marks from hyena crunching, no weathering from being dragged across the dirt and rocks. It looked processed. Tended to, Muigné knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that it had been licked by a rough, patient tongue until every scrap of tissue, every stain of life, was gone, and it had been brought here, delivered. Muigné's first instinct, born of a lifetime of protocol, was not to touch it. His hands stayed clenched at his sides. He took a slow step closer, then another, his mind racing to process the impossible sight. He began to circle the stone, his eyes missing nothing. He scanned the dust around the base of the rock. There were no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, no footprints but his own. It was as if the skull had materialized there in the night. But he knew better. He knew the couriers of the wild. His gaze lifted from the skull and swept the sea of golden grass and scrub that began just yards away. He was looking for the telltale flick of an ear, the shift of a shadow against the tawny landscape. He was searching for the author of this macabre message. At first, he saw nothing. The savannah seemed empty, holding its breath. Then, his eyes, trained by decades of spotting bones in the brush, settled on a shape. It was almost perfectly camouflaged. Under the sparse shade of a thorn acacia, about 100 yards out, was a lion, a massive, maneless Tsavo male. It was lying down, its great head resting on its paws, the picture of reptilian stillness. But it was not sleeping. Its eyes, the color of amber, were open, and they were fixed directly on Muigné. This was not the casual observation of a satiated cat. There was no laziness in that stare. This was a direct, focused gaze, an acknowledgement. The lion made no move to stand, to growl, to approach. It simply watched. It was waiting. In that silent, unnerving moment, Muigné understood. The skull was not discarded trash. It was not a random piece of bone. It was a delivery, a message, and the deliverer man was waiting for a receipt, waiting to see what the cleaner would do. A coldness spread through Muigné's chest, a feeling utterly alien to him in his work. He had handled countless remains, faced down scavengers, and walked among the ghosts of the eaten. But this was different. This wasn't fear of being attacked. The lion's posture was not aggressive. It was the profound chill of a threshold being crossed, a rule being rewritten without his consent. The unspoken pact had always been about the cleaners tidying up after the lions. The lions would hunt, they would eat, and then they would move on. Mounier's crew would follow, collecting what was left, ensuring the cycle continued cleanly and quietly. They were the janitors of the food chain. But this was the lion, engaging in the process. It had done the preliminary cleaning. It had brought the finished product to the designated drop-off point. It was participating in the ritual. Why? What did it mean? Mounier's mind spun. Whose skull was it? A poacher? A lost tourist? A member of a rival clan? The possibilities were as vast and unsettling as the landscape itself. The cleaners worked on a strict need-to-know basis. They cleaned, they processed, they didn't ask where the bones came from. The origins were irrelevant to their task. But this felt different. This felt personal. The lion had made it personal. He forced his gaze back to the lion. The great cat hadn't moved a muscle. Its stare was unwavering, a silent, burning question across the 100 yards of open ground. Mounier knew he couldn't stand here forever. The camp would be stirring soon. Others would come, and their reactions would be less controlled, more prone to panic. Panic was a dangerous currency in this land. He had to act. But how? To touch the skull felt like accepting the lion's terrifying new terms of engagement. To leave it would be an insult, a rejection of the delivery. What were the consequences of that? He had no precedent, no rule book for this. His grandfather had never spoken of lions delivering skulls to the offering stone. Slowly, deliberately, Mounier lowered himself to one knee, not in supplication, but in a gesture of careful consideration, a way to shrink his profile, to seem less of a threat. He kept his eyes on the lion, a thread of communication stretched taut between them. He raised one hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace, though he wasn't sure if it translated across species. The lion blinked, a slow, languid blink. It was the first movement it had made. Mounier felt a flicker of something, not relief, but acknowledgement. The message had been received. He was seen. He was being evaluated. He turned his attention back to the skull. He still wouldn't touch it, not yet. But he examined it again, this time with the professional eye of a cleaner. The smoothness of the bone, the lack of any damage to the delicate nasal cavity. The work was exquisite, meticulous. It was almost an act of reverence. This wasn't a trophy of a kill. It was a carefully prepared artifact. An idea, as terrifying as it was necessary, began to form in his mind. The old pact was broken. A new one had to be forged, right here, right now, with a human skull as the contract and a lion as the witness. The cleaners tidied up. That was their purpose. And this skull, delivered so deliberately, was now part of their domain. It needed to be processed. The lion hadn't just brought him a problem, it had brought him work. Mounier rose slowly to his feet. He gave one last look at the lion, a silent nod of understanding. Then he turned his back on the predator, an act of supreme trust, or perhaps supreme foolishness, and began the walk back to camp. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt just minutes before. The day's routine was shattered, but a new, more dangerous one had just begun. He had to gather his tools. He had to tell the others. He had to explain that their job had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just janitors. They were now partners. The delivery had been made, and now it was time for the cleaners to get to work. The lion watched him go, its head still resting on its paws, patient as stone. A silent partner in a new and terrifying covenant. Time seemed to stretch, thin and elastic. Mounier stood frozen, caught in a tableau of impossible stillness. There was the human skull, placed deliberately on the flat stone. There, under the distant acacia tree, was the lion, watching the ordinary sounds of the awakening savannah, the distant bark of a baboon, the chirping of early birds, felt like a rude interruption to this silent, ancient conference. The world was holding its breath. Moinyi was a man of tradition, of rules passed down through generations. He knew the protocol. A human remain found within the domain of the camp required a specific ritual. It was his duty, his purpose. But to perform it now, under that unwavering, golden gaze, felt entirely different. It felt like a performance, a sacred rite being observed by a non-human intelligence that had somehow inserted itself into the very fabric of the ceremony. His lifetime of disciplined habit was at war with a profound, dizzying sense of spiritual vertigo. What was this? What did it mean? Finally, moving as if through water, as if in a dream, Winye turned his back on the lion. In the wild, this is an act of supreme vulnerability, an invitation to attack. Here, it was an act of immense, quiet courage. It was an act of trust, or perhaps defiance. He walked slowly, deliberately, to the small ritual hut, his legs feeling heavy and wooden. He returned with a small leather pouch of sicilico herbs and his well-worn fire stick. He approached the stone once more and knelt before the skull. He wasn't kneeling in prayer, not in the way most would understand it. He was kneeling as a professional does before his work. With practiced hands, he scraped a small depression in the earth right beside the stone. He carefully placed the sacred herbs into the hollow and, using his fire stick, coaxed a tiny, smoldering mound to life. A single, thin column of sweet, pungent smoke began to rise, straight up into the windless air. As the smoke ascended, Winye began the chant. It was a wavering, mournful, and apologetic song for one whose life was taken by lions. But today, the ancient words felt foreign and new in his mouth. They were hollowed out and refilled with a new, potent meaning. He wasn't just chanting for a distant, anonymous victim of the wild. He was chanting for this specific skull, the one delivered by that specific lion. The ritual transformed. It was no longer a simple act of closure. It became a direct address, a bizarre and sacred communication within a triangle formed by the living man, the cleaned dead, and the watching killer. Lango uli funguliwa na winyamino, he chanted. The door was opened by those with teeth. The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The lion had not moved, not a muscle. Its eyes were still fixed on him, on the rising smoke, on the skull. Was it listening? Was it understanding? He took a stiff fan made of grass and began to gently wave the smoke over the skull. The ivory bone, bleached white by the sun and the lion's tongue, took on a faint, ethereal glow as it was bathed in the sacred haze. This ritual, usually a private act of closure for the human community, had become a public ceremony. It was being witnessed by the very embodiment of the door that had been opened, the predator itself. This felt less like a release of a spirit and more like a transaction being finalized. The lion had delivered the physical object. Mounye was now processing the spiritual component. Let's just pause here for a moment and really consider this scene. Imagine it. Under the rising African sun, a man is performing an ancient human ritual for the dead. He is surrounded by the vast, impartial wilderness. And watching him, with a patience that feels almost sentient, is the very agent of that death. It's a moment where the lines blur. Where does the ancient ritual end? And where does this strange, unprecedented collaboration begin? It's a question that challenges our entire understanding of the barrier between human and animal, between civilization and the wild. The herbs slowly burned down to ash. The last sorrowful note of the chant dissolved into the morning air. The smoke thinned and vanished. The ritual was complete. But Mounier did something he had never done before at this stage. He stood up, turned, and looked directly at the lion. He didn't shy away. He held its gaze across the 100 yards of sun-drenched grass. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a sign of fear or submission. It was an acknowledgement of receipt. The work is done. The balance is restored. Our business is concluded. As if this was the precise signal it had been waiting for all along, the lion moved. With an immense, muscular grace, it rose to its feet. It stretched, a long, luxurious arc of raw power. Its body a perfect silhouette against the brightening sky. It did not look at the skull again. Its delivery was complete. Instead, it looked once more at Mounier. Its golden eyes held an expression that was, and would forever remain, utterly unreadable. Then it turned. With a fluid, silent gait that defied its size and power, it melted into the tall golden grass and was gone. Simply gone. Mounier was left alone in the sudden, profound silence. He stood with the skull and the small pile of cooling ash. The sun was fully up now, its heat beginning to bake the land. But a deep, unshakable chill ran through him, touching his very core. The world felt different. He used his long, hooked pole to gently lift the skull, now ritually cleansed and spiritually settled. He carried it to the designated area for human remains, a place of respect and remembrance. He placed it carefully into a basket with the others. The act was complete. The job was done. But the world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. The clear, sharp line between the cleaner and the one he cleaned for had blurred into an unrecognizable smudge. The lion was no longer just the abstract source of his work, a force of nature he contended with. It had become a participant, a partner, a silent collaborator in the most sacred of his duties. And Mounier knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any lion's roar, that nothing would ever be the same again. The story of the returned skull didn't spread through the cleaning camp like news. It was more like a tremor, a deep, unsettling vibration that everyone felt but no one dared to name. The other cleaners, men who had faced death in its rawest forms, didn't speak of it in loud, clear voices. Instead, they exchanged glances. When they looked at Moigny, their eyes held a new, uneasy respect. It was a look that acknowledged he had crossed a boundary they had only ever skirted. And when they gazed into the dense bush that ringed their small, temporary world, they looked longer, harder, as if trying to pierce a veil that had suddenly become tangible. The nightly ritual of placing the offering bowl took on a new weight, a renewed sense of gravity. Before, it was a simple act of gratitude, a tradition passed down, a bit of food, a gesture of respect to the spirits of the land. But now, as they placed the bowl at the edge of the firelight, a question hung unspoken in the humid air. Was this just food anymore, or was it something else? A payment, perhaps. A fee for services rendered. A quiet transaction with the shadows. For Mounier, the event was more than a tremor. It was a crack in the very lens through which he viewed his entire life's work. He started to see things he'd previously overlooked. Small details that had always been present but now glinted with a strange, almost sinister meaning. He thought about the bones they collected day after day. They were often too clean, too perfect. He knew the habits of predators. Lions are messy eaters. They tear and rend, leaving sinew and scraps. Hyenas, with their powerful jaws, crush and shatter bones, scattering the fragments across the savannah. But so many of the bones they found, especially the smaller human ones, a finger, a rib, a vertebra, were in a state of near-perfect preparation. It was as if they had been meticulously curated, cleaned with an unnatural precision. He recalled the old tales, the fireside stories whispered by elders. Stories of lions hiding their kills, of dragging carcasses to secret larders deep within the thickets. He'd always dismissed them as simple folklore, attempts to explain the unexplainable. But now, a chilling possibility began to form in his mind. Was it possible that some of the bones they collected were unearthed from kills made along their usual routes? Could they be deliveries? Were these remains being brought from farther away, from the hidden corners of the lion's territory, and discreetly deposited for them to find? The thought was a cold stone in his gut. The legend of the returned skull, as it was already becoming, formalized a suspicion that had always whispered at the very edge of their understanding. It was a truth they had danced around for years, a reality too profound to confront directly. The lions were aware. They weren't just instinct-driven beasts, moving through the world on a cycle of hunt, kill, and eat. They were more than aware, they were complicit. They understood the cleaner's purpose. They knew what the men were doing as they moved through the tall grass, collecting the sad remnants of human tragedy. And in the case of the skull, one lion had gone a step further. It had actively facilitated their work. It had completed the physical cleaning itself, stripping the bone bare with a purpose that seemed to go beyond mere hunger. Then, it had initiated the ritual cycle by making the delivery, placing the final piece of a person back into the hands of their own kind. This single act changed the fundamental nature of the pact they lived by. It was no longer a simple, reactive symbiosis, a natural cycle of you kill, we clean. The lion's action hinted at something far more complex, a proactive partnership. The lions, those ultimate realists, creatures of pure, unadulterated instinct and need, were engaging in a behavior that had a symbolic dimension. It was an act of communication. They were not just leaving bones behind as a consequence of their feeding. They were, in a very real sense, giving them, and in return, they accepted the nightly offering. They accepted the food, and apparently, they accepted the spiritual cleansing that came with it. The chants, the smoke, the quiet reverence, it wasn't just for the humans. It was for them, too. As evening fell and the campfire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows, Munye sat apart from the others. The flames painted his face in shifting hues of orange and red, but his expression was a mask of deep, unmoving contemplation. In his hands, he held a small bone he had found that day. It was a human knuckle bone, perfectly clean, smooth, and pale in the firelight. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing its delicate contours. It was a piece of a person, a life now reduced to this small, sterile object. But it felt like more. It felt like a message. The unspoken exchange from that morning haunted him. The silent moment when he had faced the lioness, the skull resting between her paws, his slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, the lion's equally deliberate departure, melting back into the dawn mist. It felt like the closing of a deal, a contract signed without a single word, a deal he had never intended to make. All his life, he had believed in his purpose with absolute certainty. He was serving his community, serving the spiritual world. He was a custodian of peace, managing the brutal aftermath of nature's violence, ensuring that the spirits of the dead could find rest. He brought order to the chaos, dignity to the undignified. But now, sitting by the fire, turning the small bone in his hands, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Was he truly serving his people, or was he, in fact, serving the lions? Had his life's sacred duty been a form of employment? Was he their sanitation worker, their spiritual adjunct? He thought of the chants, he murmured, The sacred smoke he offered to the winds. Were those rituals really for the peace of human spirits? Or were they for the smooth functioning of the lion's realm? A way of keeping the spiritual landscape tidy, cleansing the air of restless ghosts so the next hunt could proceed undisturbed. The weight of this new perspective was crushing. He had seen himself as a guardian of a sacred balance between the human world and the wild. Now, he feared he was just a cog in the lion's machine, a tool they used to maintain their dominion. The respect he thought he commanded from the wild was perhaps something else entirely. It was the detached acknowledgement one gives to a useful servant. He shared none of this turmoil aloud. He couldn't. To voice these doubts would be to break the profound silence that was the very foundation of their work, of their entire existence. It would be to admit that the understanding they had all lived by for generations might be a grand misunderstanding. To suggest that their perceived respect might actually be a form of servitude. That the sacred balance they so carefully maintained was not a balance at all, but a leash. A leash held by a paw, not a hand. So he carried the knowledge alone. It was a cold, sharp thing, like a shard of bone lodged next to his heart, digging in deeper with every breath. The watcher in the dawn, the lioness with the knowing eyes, had not just delivered a skull, it had delivered a doubt, a poison for the soul. And unlike the spirits of the dead, this was a presence that could not be cleansed away by any smoke, nor quieted by any chant. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the camp fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. But Moignet did not sleep. He rose and walked to the edge of the camp, to the very spot where the offering bowl sat. He stood there for a long time, looking out into the impenetrable darkness, the same darkness that had swallowed the lioness that morning. He didn't look with fear. The fear was gone, replaced by something far heavier. He looked into the vast, silent night with a profound, weary questioning in his eyes. He was a man standing on the edge of his world, realizing the map he had followed his entire life might have been drawn by someone else. And in the great, silent dark, he waited for an answer he knew would never come. The man who inherited this gnawing, terrible doubt was named Simba. A name given to him for the very creature he was meant to manage, a hopeful, maybe even a foolish charm against the lion. Simba was the apprentice and designated successor to Moignet, the old bone cleaner. In his final years, Moignet had grown quiet, his words few, but his eyes held a weight that Simba, as a young man, couldn't quite fathom. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions. When Moignet's time finally came, his bones weren't cleaned by lions. His own people prepared them, granting him the most peaceful of smoke rituals before his final rest. And with that, the sacred hook pole, the symbol of his office, passed into Simba's hand. He was now the lead cleaner. For years, Simba carried out his duties with flawless precision. The entire ritual was a rhythm he knew by heart. The collection of the bones from the savannah, the careful sorting, the sacred smoke, the ancient chants, and finally the offering of food back to the spirits and the wild. He was a pillar of his community, performing a vital spiritual service. But that seed of doubt, planted by Moignet's silent crisis, had taken root deep inside him. It grew slowly, quietly, until it compelled Simba to do something no bone cleaner before him had ever dared. He started to count. It wasn't a grand, sudden decision. It began subtly, almost unconsciously. He would simply make a mental note of the number of human bone sets he collected in a week. Then, on his rare visits to the main village, or the camps of the nomadic pastoralists, who sometimes passed through the territory, he would listen. He'd listen for the stories that always accompany a death. An elder passing from a fever was a story discussed in hushed tones. A child tragically lost to a snake bite was a collective sorrow mourned by all. A herdsman gored by a buffalo was a known tragedy, a cautionary tale. He began to match these known deaths, these stories, against the bones he was collecting from the wild. At first, the numbers seemed to align. More or less, a few sets of bones that had no story attached could be explained away easily enough. They could have been travelers passing through, or solitary hunters whose disappearances went unreported in the scattered communities. These were acceptable anomalies, statistical noise in the great cycle of life and death. But as the months turned into seasons, and the seasons into years, a clear and undeniable discrepancy emerged. The bones kept coming in. It was a steady, low trickle, but it was constant. Yet the reported deaths from all causes, illness, accident, even other animal attacks were fewer. There were consistently more bones than there were stories to explain them. The math simply didn't add up. This unsettling discovery pushed Simba to expand his accounting. He turned his meticulous attention to the animal bones. He was a man of the bush. He knew the rough populations of the herbivores, the zebras, the wildebeest, the gazelles. He understood the rhythms of predation. A lion pride, for instance, kills with a certain frequency just to feed itself. It's a matter of survival. The bones left behind from those kills should, therefore, form a predictable pattern, a baseline number. But the number of zebra mandibles, wildebeest skulls, and gazelle leg bones he was collecting was abundant. It was far more than the known lion prides in their territory could logically produce. It was as if they were killing far, far beyond their need for sustenance, engaging in a level of waste that simply made no sense in the natural world. A cold, meticulous clarity began to settle over him, replacing the vague unease with a sharp, terrifying focus. He wasn't just collecting the random leavings of natural predation. The volume was all wrong. The logistics didn't fit. These bones weren't just being left behind where they fell. They were being provided. He was no longer just an observer of a natural cycle. He felt like a cog in a machine he didn't understand. Let's just pause for a moment and try to imagine this. Imagine the dawning horror of that realization. Your entire life, your identity, your sacred duty is built on a single, fundamental premise that you are managing the aftermath of a natural process. You are the spiritual janitor of the savannah, tidying up after nature takes its course. And then, piece by piece, you realize that premise might be a complete lie. You realize that you're not managing a natural process at all. You are, instead, a participant in a system you do not control. A system that is actively, deliberately feeding you evidence for a purpose you cannot comprehend. His mind immediately flashed back to the incident with the returned skullfer, human skull placed neatly back at the edge of the offering site. That wasn't an anomaly, a random act of a confused animal. He saw it now for what it was. It was a clue. It was the moment a silent partner in this strange arrangement grew bold, perhaps even arrogant enough to show its hand. The lions weren't just opportunistic scavengers, benefiting from the cleaners' nightly rituals of leaving out food. They were active, intelligent participants in the cycle. They hunted, they ate, and then, it seemed, they gathered the cleaned, sun-bleached bones and deliberately placed them where the cleaners, where Simba would be sure to find them. But why? To what end? The nightly offering of food, the gesture he performed with such reverence, suddenly felt childish and naive. It was a token gesture in a massive transaction whose true currency wasn't meat, but bone. And perhaps the spiritual absolution that the community believed came with the proper ritual handling of those bones. He wasn't maintaining balance. He was running a disposal service. A disposal service for a business whose full, terrifying scope he was only just beginning to glimpse. As he sat by the fire that night, the evening's collection of bones piled nearby. He looked out into the profound darkness of the bush. His eyes were wide, not with simple fear, but with the staggering, world-altering shock of understanding. The familiar sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a hyena suddenly sounded different, like the ticking gears of a hidden, cosmic machine that had just been revealed to him. The game had changed, and he was a player who had just realized he never even knew the rules. The implication hit Simba like a physical blow, a yawning chasm opening right at his feet. The numbers didn't lie. If the lions were bringing more bones than their natural kills could ever account for, then the source of those extra bones was a question that turned his blood to ice. Where were they coming from? It was a simple question, but the silence that followed it was heavy with dread. He stood there, under the vast, indifferent Tsavo sky, and felt a terror unlike any he had ever known. It wasn't the fear of a predator in the dark. It was the fear of a truth that could unravel the very fabric of his world. The cleaners had always believed they understood the cycle of life and death, that they were the sacred custodians of its final chapter. But this suggested a different story altogether. A story written in bone and blood that they had been reading all wrong. The first, most obvious answer was also the most terrifying. What if the lions were killing specifically to generate bones for the cleaners? The thought was sheer madness. Lions kill to eat, they kill to survive. The idea of them killing for a secondary, abstract purpose to feed a ritual, to sustain some unspoken pact, was a level of premeditation and symbolism that belonged to humans, not animals. It suggested an intelligence working with a logic that was utterly alien and deeply, profoundly sinister. Could it be? Could these magnificent predators, these icons of the wild, be engaged in a form of ritual killing? Not for hunger, but for what? For the sake of the cleaner's work. It made no sense. And yet, the numbers on his makeshift ledger pointed towards something unnatural. The daily tally of bones was too consistent, too high. It was as if the lions were fulfilling a quota. The thought made him shudder. It reframed their entire existence, turning the sacred balance they served into a horrifying, orchestrated performance. But then, a second possibility began to form in his mind, and somehow it was even worse. What if the lions were not the sole hunters? What if they were also collectors? Scavengers on a grand, macabre scale. The idea was chilling. Could they be ranging far beyond their normal territory, moving through the moonlit savannah not as hunters, but as couriers of the dead? He imagined them, these powerful beasts, gathering bones from old battlefields where forgotten skirmishes had played out, from ancient graves disturbed by time and weather, from every corner of Tsavo where death had left its white, sun-bleached signature. He pictured them picking their way through the acacia thorns, not with a fresh kill in their jaws, but with the skull of a long-dead wildebeest, or the ribcage of a zebra from a season past. They would be bringing them back, depositing them in the cleaner's path, like a carefully curated delivery. This vision transformed the lions from simple predators into something far more complex and unsettling. They weren't just part of the ecosystem. They were its archivists, the curators of death itself, and the cleaners. They were the librarians, unknowingly sorting and shelving a ghastly collection whose origins were a mystery. They thought they were honoring the recent dead, but perhaps they were cataloguing an entire history of demise, orchestrated by their silent, four-legged partners. Either way he looked at it, the conclusion was the same, and it was inescapable. The cleaners were not in a simple, symbiotic relationship with nature. They were caught in a web, a complex and terrifying arrangement they had never suspected. Their rituals, their smoke that rose to the heavens. Their ancient chants, the very things that gave their work meaning and protected them from the spiritual dangers of their trade, were not just for their own benefit. They were, in fact, part of the lure. The lions valued the cleansing. They wanted the spirits pacified. He tried to imagine the world from a lion's perspective, a world of instinct and ancient knowing. Perhaps they believed, in their fathomless, primal way, that the cleaner's work made the hunting grounds better, that it kept the unseen world in order and ensured the continued prosperity of their pride. The cleaners, in their unwavering devotion to their sacred duty, were providing a spiritual service to the very forces that were generating the need for it. They were complicit, unwitting accomplices in a cycle whose true edges they could not see. Their sacred duty was a service. Yes, but who was the client? It seemed, terrifyingly, that the client was the predator itself. The daily offering of food left for the cleaners, the small bits of meat, suddenly seemed insulting. It was a pittance, a token gesture. The real offering wasn't the food. The real offering was their labor, their solemn intent, their uniquely human capacity to create meaning from the chaos of death. The lions were trading bones for peace of mind. They were providing the raw material, the skeletal remains, and in return, the cleaners provided a spiritual cleansing service. And the source of those bones, that was the secret at the heart of the pact. A secret the cleaners were never meant to uncover. A secret that would shatter their entire worldview. They had always seen themselves as servants of a higher, natural order. Now, Simba was beginning to suspect they were merely employees in a grim, silent transaction. He looked down at his hands, at the tools of his trade that he had held since he was a boy. The smooth-worn pole used to carry the bone baskets. The baskets themselves, woven with skill, passed down through generations. They were no longer instruments of sacred service. They felt different in his grasp. They were the tools of a conscripted workforce, laborers in an economy they didn't understand. He glanced over at the small offering bowl left near their camp that morning. It was not an acknowledgement between equals, a sign of mutual respect between the keepers of the day and the kings of the night. It was a tip, a payment, a bone, as it were, thrown to a useful creature for a job well done. The respect he had always felt from the lions, the sense of a shared space governed by unspoken rules, all of it curdled into something demeaning. They weren't partners, they were being managed. Later that day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah, Simba stood before the day's collection. He looked at the pile of collected bones, the same kind of pile he had seen every day of his adult life. But now, he saw them differently. They were no longer just remains to be cared for, to be honored and returned to the earth. He saw them as units of accounting in a terrible, hidden economy. Each femur, each vertebra, each fractured skull was a tally mark, a piece of a gruesome transaction. The entire landscape, once a place of profound spiritual significance, now felt like a vast open-air factory floor. And he and his kin were just part of the machinery. The sacred rhythm of their lives was nothing more than the turning of a gear in a machine whose purpose was monstrous. The terror that gripped him then was not the simple fear of being eaten. That was a clean, comprehensible end, a part of the natural world he had always accepted. A lion kills you, it eats you. Your bones are found, cleansed, and your spirit is sent on its way. There was an honesty to that. No, the terror that had taken root in his soul was the terror of understanding, of seeing the full, dreadful shape of their arrangement. The lions had not just been watching them work from a distance, coexisting with them, they had been managing them, supervising them, ensuring the work got done. And Simba, by the simple act of counting, by applying human logic to the patterns of the wild, had finally read the ledger. He had balanced the books of a company he never knew he worked for. The silence of the lions was not a sign of respect. It was the silence of a foreman overseeing his crew. The world had not changed, but his perception of it had shattered into a million pieces. And in that moment, standing before a pile of bones under the twilight sky, Simba felt a loneliness more profound than he had ever imagined possible. He was no longer a priest of nature, he was a prisoner of it. The knowledge was a stone in his gut, a cold, heavy weight that settled deep inside him. Simba went through the motions for one more day, a ghost haunting the familiar paths of his life. He walked the routes, but the world had shifted under his feet. Where he once saw a random scattering of remains, he now saw a deliberate, almost sinister placement. A bleached skull was not just lying there. It was tucked against a rock, its empty sockets facing the path as if watching. A cluster of vertebrae wasn't a natural pile. It was lined up like beads on a string, arranged with intention on a fallen log. He saw the patterns everywhere, a language he had never been taught, but now understood perfectly. He used his hooked pole, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime. He filled his baskets, the dry rattle of bones, a sound he had always known. But his hands felt like they belonged to a stranger, performing a task that had become alien and monstrous. He was an actor in a play, and he had just read the secret script meant only for the director. That evening, the familiar chants died in his throat. He sat by the fire, letting the voices of the other cleaners wash over him. He watched the smoke curl and twist into the night sky, but he saw no spiritual path for the spirits of the dead. He saw a signal fire, a beacon that told the silent partners in the tall grass that everything was as it should be. It was a confirmation of their location, a signal of their continued, unknowing compliance. The fire wasn't for the spirits, it was for the lions. Later, when the camp was quiet and the moon was high, it was his turn. His turn to take the offering, the small strip of meat in a clay bowl, and place it on the flat stone at the edge of the clearing. It was the final ritual of the day, a gesture of respect, a pact between the living and the dead, or so he had always believed. But tonight was different. He stood at the edge of the firelight, the bowl in his hands, the meat cool against the clay. He looked from the offering to the dark, rustling blackness of the savannah beyond. He could feel them there, waiting, expectant. The silent partners in this grand, silent company. He felt no reverence, no spiritual connection. All he felt was a cold, clear fury. It wasn't aimed at the lions. They were just being what they were. The fury was for the understanding itself, for the beautiful, terrible lie that had been his entire life, his purpose, his faith. He did not place the bowl on the stone. With a final, steady breath, he turned his back on the waiting darkness and walked back toward the dwindling fire. He sat and he ate the meat himself, chewing slowly, deliberately. Each bite was a punctuation mark, a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. He tasted the grit, the sinew, the finality of it all. When he was done, he drank the water meant to accompany the offering. Then he stood up, a different man than the one who had walked out to the offering stone just minutes before. The pact was broken. The old Simba was gone. In the grey, pre-dawn light, while the others slept their innocent sleep, he moved through the camp like a shadow. He gathered every tool of the cleaning trade, every object that defined their existence. The long, hooked poles, their wooden curves, worn smooth and dark by generations of hands, hands that had believed the same lie he had. The baskets, woven from sharp, resilient leaves, their structure still strong, designed to carry the weight of their sacred duty. He collected the small leather pouches of ritual herbs they burned to purify the air, the fanning grasses used to clear the ground. the special stones they used for grinding bones into dust. He even took the thick, stiff buffalo hide aprons that protected them. He carried it all, an armful of forgotten history, to the very center of the camp's clearing. This was the place where they usually built the cleansing fire, the fire of renewal. But he did not build a fire, he made a pile. A neat, solemn, final pile. It was a careful arrangement, not a chaotic discard. He laid the poles side by side like soldiers laid to rest. He stacked the baskets one inside the other. He placed the heavy aprons on top, a final shroud. This was not just getting rid of old tools, it was a formal decommissioning, a surrender. He was laying down the liturgy of his people. He was closing the library of their knowledge. He was breaking the circuit that had powered their lives for as long as anyone could remember. This was a grave for a profession. As the first true light of dawn, pale orange and pink, touched the top of the pile, Simba took one last look around the camp. This small collection of huts had been his life's only home. He looked at the sleeping forms of the other cleaners, men who did not yet know the accounting, who did not yet understand the true nature of their balance sheet. He felt a sharp pang in his chest. It wasn't regret for what he was doing, but a deep, profound sorrow for the innocence he was leaving behind. They would wake up in a few hours to avoid where their purpose had been. They would find the tools of their identity laid out like a corpse. They would have to find a new way to live, or they would have to leave this place that was no longer what they thought it was. He turned away, carrying nothing. No pole to lean on, no basket to fill, no pouch of herbs to offer comfort. He walked out of the camp, away from the life he knew. He didn't follow one of the bone collection paths that spider-webbed out into the savannah. He chose a new direction, toward the distant, hazy blue hills where no bone cleaner had ever needed to go, because their world had always been confined to the lion's territory. He did not look back. To look back would be to see that sad, neat pile of tools in the center of the camp. To look back might be to see if a tawny, muscular shape was watching from the tall grass, its yellow eyes filled with confusion, or perhaps with a dawning comprehension. He didn't want to know. He had broken the pact. He had resigned from the silent company of the bone cleaners. He left the tools for the lions to see, if they even cared to look. It was a message written in objects, a final memo to his former business partners. We are done. The service is closed. Find another way to tidy your world. The long, sacred profession of the Wakuzanya Mifupa, the bone cleaners, ended that morning. It didn't end with a roar of a lion or a scream of a man. It didn't end in a climactic battle or a bloody massacre. It ended with a pile of silent, abandoned tools catching the first rays of the morning sun. And with one man walking away from a truth that was simply too heavy to carry any longer. He walked and walked, his solitary figure shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape, becoming just another part of the scenery, until he disappeared over the horizon, leaving nothing behind but a story, and a silence where a tradition used to be. Welcome back under baobab skies. The fire is just embers now, and the story we have tended tonight, gathered here in the flickering dark, is a cold one. It's a story that ends not with a neat resolution, not with a victory or a defeat, but with a profound, echoing question that will linger long after the last coal has turned to ash. We have walked a difficult path tonight, side by side with the bone cleaners of Tsavo. We've learned of their traditions, their quiet, solemn role as the custodians of the aftermath. We saw how they operated, understanding their strict rules of distance. The way they spoke, a language woven from smoke signals and ancient chants. We learned of their economy of offering, a system of tribute and respect paid to the great predators of the plain. We felt the chill run down our spines as we witnessed that pivotal, terrifying moment, the moment the line between a distant observer and an unwilling participant dissolved completely. That moment came with the delivery of a single, perfectly polished skull. A message sent from the wild, a demand that could not be refused. And it was, in that moment, we stood with Simba, the young cleaner who dared to do the unthinkable. He counted, he looked beyond the veils of ritual and sacred duty and saw the cold, hard ledger beneath. And in that ledger, he uncovered a truth so shattering it could not be borne. The pact, the sacred understanding he and his people had lived by for generations, was not mutual. The arrangement was not one of respect between equals. It was something else entirely. It was a utilization. The lions, those ancient, inscrutable masters of the plain, had not just tolerated the cleaners, they had, in their own silent, powerful way, employed them. The bones were the currency, the stark payment for services rendered. The cleaners' sacred rituals, their chants to guide the spirits of the dead, their offerings of smoke and polished bonnet was all a service. They were not partners with the wild. They were its spiritual groundskeepers, tidying up the metaphysical mess left behind by the ceaseless cycle of the hunt. This realization changed everything. The sacred pact was revealed as a contract, and the bone cleaners were merely its most devoted and most deceived employees. The image of that pile of tools left in the pale light of dawn is one of the most powerful silences in any story. It is not an act of defiance, not a victory. It is a withdrawal, a quiet, final resignation. It is the human spirit, cornered and compromised, saying, "There is a line I will not cross. There is a price I will not pay, even if crossing that line is shrouded in the holiest of duties, even if the alternative is to abandon your people's place in the grand, established order of things." Simba chose the terror of freedom over the cold security of a servitude he now understood all too well. He chose to walk away, to break the cycle, even if it meant becoming lost to history. Let's just pause for a moment here, in the quiet of this night. Think of that pile of abandoned tools, the smooth-handled scrapers, the polishing stones, the gourds for water. It is a monument. A silent testament to the absolute limit of human partnership with the wild. We can hunt alongside it. We can live in fear of it. We can even build our religions and our rituals to worship it. But can we ever truly be in its employ? Can we serve its alien, unyielding logic without sacrificing the very essence of what makes us human? Simba's choice tells us that, for him, the answer was no. The cost was too high. So what happened after? The bones of Tsavo remained. The cycle of life and death didn't pause for a moment. The lions continued to kill, to eat, to reign with undisputed majesty over their domain. But no one came to sort the remains. No one came to chant the old words, to send the smoke signals, to make the offerings. The spiritual clutter began to accumulate. The stories of the dead, once so carefully processed and honored, went unheard. The metaphysical waste of the plains was left to fester. The wild had to manage its own ghosts now. And what of the cleaners? They vanished. They slipped away from the historical record, leaving behind only this story, this whispered, cautionary tale passed down around fires just like this one. A tale about the terrible price of looking too deeply into the eyes of the predator you think you have an arrangement with. It warns us that when you make a deal with a power you don't fully understand, you must always be prepared to discover you are not the one holding the terms. Some say, on certain nights, when the moon hangs high and heavy over the vast plains of Tsavo, you can still see a tawny shape sitting near the crumbling ruins of an old thorn boma. A lion, sitting with an unnatural stillness, as if waiting. waiting for a bowl of polished bone that will never come, watching the horizon for a plume of smoke that will never rise again. The great partnership is over. Only the memory of it lingers in the land, a ghost on the wind, carrying with it that one unsettling question that we are left with tonight. Who was truly cleaning for whom? The embers fade. The story of the silent pact is told. Thank you for sharing this time with me. You are under baobab skies,